All right, well, welcome, Douglas. Douglas Childress is going to be speaking to us today, and he was the first Manchester Wesley Research Center sabbatical fellow that we've had, so a new program that we started last year, which is designed for pastors or lay people or missionaries to work on a project related to their ministry context. And so Doug was here last summer working on the project that he's going to talk to you about today related to the Methodist Church in Estonia, where he's speaking to us from. So Doug, I'll turn it over to you to give your presentation. So are you getting any feedback?
No, right now it's pretty good.
So let me know if you are, and then I'll mute this if you are, but yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jordan. And I would just like to begin by thanking you for the opportunity to be at Manchester and to study and to research for the What Would Wesley Preach project. And it was great to meet with David Bundy next to you as well. And I'm so grateful for the hospitality I received there. Today, what I'm sharing with you about is a project that went on in Estonia and is actually still ongoing in the Methodist Church called What Would Wesley Preach? And the genesis of this project, which I'll get into in a little bit, is on May 24th, 2018, on the 280th anniversary of John Wesley's Aldersgate experience, and also to mark the 110th anniversary of the Estonian Methodist Church. John Wesley's standard 52 sermons were published in Estonian for the first time ever. There had been some sermons that had been translated before, many years previous, but their quality wasn't nearly as good, and also there were just a handful of them. There weren't an entire compilation of them in Estonian. So as you can imagine, this was a big deal in the Estonian context. For the first time ever, people could read Wesley's sermons for themselves in their heart language. And the leadership within the Methodist system had a desire for the both by the seminary and the church to introduce Wesley's preaching to clergy and laity at a deeper level. The publication of the Standard 52 was an amazing opportunity to share Wesley's understandings as found in these sermons, since Estonians would now have better access to them than ever before. Prior to publication, there was already a great deal of interest in Wesley within the Methodist Church in general. In 2016 and 2017, the seminary hosted what we termed a course of study for lay leaders within the Methodist Church. And what we did was we put together weekend-long seminars where they came and they spent the night at a church. And during those times, there would be times of worship. There would also be education. And we would have blocks of education for these leaders. The blocks included theology, Bible, counseling, general leadership, and also church history. And all segments were well received by the leadership, the lay leadership. And my section on church history actually was a 4-hour going into the life of John Wesley. I went through his life and also tried to take lessons from his life to apply to their faith and also to leading their congregations. So that was one thing that had happened previous to this. Also, regarding the clergy, in 2017, the district superintendent, Tavi Holman, and I presented at a pastor's conference on the topic, how did John Wesley's personal renewal bring about renewal in the church? And this study focused on John Wesley's spiritual journey and attempted to connect it to the lives of pastors serving within the Estonian context. And the reason I was asked to do this, and the district superintendent presented as well, is in the clergy there is a significant interest in Wesley and his life. Regarding the wider church, every year they have a summer conference. And at this conference, there are about 200 people who attend. And so it's a pretty big deal. It's a 3-day event that happens at a camp in Estonia, and you spend the night for that time. They have meals, they have worship, they have special guests come in and talk from all over the world sometimes. And as part of that, in light of these sermons just being published, they also asked me to have 2 one-hour lectures on 2 of Wesley's sermons, one on his sermon on the new birth and one on the marks of the new birth. And I was supposed to go through those systematically in some ways and just share with them what Wesley said and try to take some modern day applications from that. And there was interest in that as well, and it was kind of neat. There was a pastor who was following along with me in his Estonian version of Wesley and seeing how well I covered the points. And at the end, he came to me and said, why didn't you spend so much time on this point? So actually that shows a good thing about having it in your own language, that I as the speaker might not know what you as the hearer really need to be having addressed. So it's great that you're able to do the work yourself. But once again, that was received really well. In my session, there were about 100 people to each session. And in a church of 1,500 people, that's a pretty good segment of the church, albeit there are people from outside of Estonia as well. But all of that is to say there are opportunities in the Estonian Methodist context for interest in Wesley and his ideas and in his sermons. And it's especially, there's a special interest if Wesley's thought is shown to be applicable to lives today. So that's kind of the challenge that the church has if you're trying to introduce them to Wesleyan thought, is making sure it's applicable to them. So that's a little bit about the context and opportunities. So now I'll tell you a little bit about the What Would Wesley Preach project itself. The Estonian Methodist Church, in conjunction with Baltic Methodist Theological Seminary, aspired for a 2-year project to improve both student and pastoral preaching abilities, as well as to introduce both clergy and seminary students to John Wesley's preaching. And towards that end, the seminary and church together organized 2 two-day preaching seminars attended by students and also active clergy within the Methodist Church. And the first one took place in September of 2018, and the second's going to happen here in March, early in March. The seminar was offered in 2 languages. If you're not familiar with the Estonian context, about 70% of the population speaks Estonian as their heart language, and about 30% Russian, with some variation when you include people in who don't speak Estonian from other contexts, such as Ukrainian. There is also English translation as needed, and by that I mean when I was present, and my wife would be the one who was translating for me. The 2 seminars had 3 primary goals. The first was to improve the level of preaching within the Estonian Methodist Church, particularly among active clergy. I think that's something that every Methodist congregation aspires for, is better preaching in some ways, and maybe every church in the world. So we looked at that as obviously a worthwhile goal. Also, we wanted to, at a deeper level, introduce pastors to Wesley's sermons, once again trying to impress on them that this work had been achieved, and just trying to really encourage them to interact with them and to be reading them. And finally, to produce contemporary sermons based on outlines of Wesley's standard 52 sermons. And that, which I'll cover in a little bit later in outcomes, was homework given to the participants. At the first gathering in September, we had over 40 participants, well over 20 pastors. I think there are somewhere between 20 and 25 Methodist congregations in Estonia, so this is actually a significant turnout which we had. There were also students there, and just some people who were interested in learning more about more effective preaching. The gathering occurred at the Baltic Methodist Center, where there is a congregation which meets, actually two, an Estonian-speaking and a Russian-speaking Methodist congregation. And also the seminary is housed in the center as well. The seminar involved homiletical instruction from the seminary's two preaching lecturers, a panel discussion involving modern needs in preaching, which included a fairly well-known preacher within the greater church in Estonia, among others. Instruction from a communications expert on how to make ideas stick, and among other topics, all related to preaching. At this, I was tasked with two things. One, I presented a lecture on early Methodist preachers and tried to show lessons which might be able to be used by their example in our present day regarding preaching. I did a little bit of research on that at Manchester as well. My wife, who you just met a few moments ago, who is now the rector of the seminary, translated for me, as well as she was a significant part in organizing this event. Intertwined throughout this conference, participants were further introduced to the translation of the standard 52 sermons. And in the final session, I delivered an approximately 30-minute sermon, which was slightly longer, with simultaneous translation going on in Estonian and in Russian, of the work I did at Manchester on Wesley's sermon on the marks of the new birth. And the roughly 40 participants then had about 20 minutes to critique my sermon through interaction with me, as well as they were able to grade it using a system they were given throughout the conference. One critique I had, kind of showing how this is a difficult process when you're using someone else's outline. I liked a lot of the scriptures that Wesley used, and I was told that I had too many scriptures in my sermon. So that was one of the things I learned, is that for today's audience, even for preachers, Wesley may have used too many scriptural examples. So as I said, as part of the homework, the participants we're encouraged to take one of Wesley's sermons and, using the basic outline, turn it into a modern sermon. The sermon was then to be preached at the Future Preaching Conference in March, and we hope that eventually these will be in some way, shape, or form published. Let's see. Okay, I've still got some time. Good. I was just going to go into some of the challenges I faced in this project for myself in writing such a sermon. The process of turning one of Wesley's sermons into a contemporary message, which isn't just putting it into contemporary language, but making something new out of it. First, I was the first person in this project to attempt to adapt one of these sermons. It was my wife's idea that this would be beneficial and useful to the church to not only have Wesley's sermons translated, but also have a contemporary sermon written in Estonian, which would show their teachings being explained and applied in a modern way. And she encouraged, being a spouse, told me that it would be best if I was the first person to attempt this, so that I could actually show others that it can actually be done. And so I actually thought myself it was a worthy project, so I agreed to the task, and I began. So sometimes when you're the first person to do something, that of course gives you your own challenges. It may have been done, maybe you all are aware of someone who's done this sort of thing, but it was new to me. I had never really tried or attempted something like this. So the challenge of the new. Second, I had to figure out how not to merely write his language in a contemporary way, but to write a sermon, a modern sermon from these texts, still using his outline. Sometimes I did summarize what he said, which if you're using his outline, you sometimes have to do if you're trying to encapsulate his thought, but that wasn't what I was trying to do. I wasn't just trying to say it in a contemporary way. I'll share a couple sources with you of people who have done that, but that wasn't the project. He was trying to also make something new. So there was that tension. Keep his ideas, keep the outline somewhat, but also it's mine as well. So that was an interesting process to be a part of. Also, I had to figure out how much emphasis to place on one specific section of the sermon. If you read out Wesley's sermon on the marks of the new birth, I didn't do it, but I'm guessing that I aspire to do no more than 30 minutes. And I think if I read the thing out and it doesn't have huge amounts of examples or illustrations in it, it would probably take 20 some minutes if you were reading it in a way that people could actually, absorb what you're actually saying, maybe even longer. So you got to make cuts. Where do you cut? What do you emphasize? What don't you emphasize? Fourth, there were stylistic issues I had to deal with. Being a Methodist minister and one who is of the holiness tradition, I have to say that I agree with most of Wesley's thoughts. I can't think of a lot that I outright disagree with him on. However, we're different people. We think a little bit differently. I mean, it's really hard sometimes to work with other people's thought processes and interact with it and make it your own. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. So I had to grapple with that issue as well. Also, there were occasional words or concepts which I had to more firmly understand in Wesley's sermons. Words which in some ways you can get by, in a seminary or in a lecture for that matter, you could just regurgitate them back word for word what Wesley said, and you get the idea, but I'm also trying to make people of different levels better understand his thoughts. So I had to research a little bit what would be a good modern word for what he's using. So that was another issue I had to grapple with. And in that process, I found there were some works that were quite helpful in determining more modern words to use. One, both in your library, Kenneth Kinghorn's John Wesley on Christian Beliefs, the Standard Sermons in Modern English, and Sermons on Several Occasions translated into modern English by James Holway. So those were some issues I had to grapple with as I was trying to write this contemporary sermon based on Wesley's sermons. And in doing this, I wrote for myself some guidelines, some criteria that I followed throughout the process. Some I was able to follow more closely than others. And it had 8 parts to it. And actually, a person who's writing one of the sermons now asked me for those guidelines, and I gave them to them because they were also looking for some assistance of how to go about this process. So these were, 1, the sermon should be a sermon which could be preached within a time frame of 20 to 30 minutes. Anything longer than that, I think today can be sometimes hard for people to digest. 2, I said the sermon should preach Wesley's teachings as found in the sermon with great care not to contradict Wesley. I was preparing in case I saw something in there that I disagreed with, which I didn't actually in this case. But it was kind of just a check on myself that, okay, if I do disagree with something, part of the project is that I'm trying to put forth his thought, not where I disagree. So if I disagreed with something, I would just kind of not put it in the sermon, is what I was thinking. 3rd, the message should follow the general outline of Wesley's sermon. That was one of the things we were tasked with doing. So I attempted to keep to that criteria. 4th, attempt to place the emphasis of the message on where a modern audience needs to hear the emphasis. So there are certain things that Wesley was discussing in the sermons that while important, I didn't think the modern hearer needed to hear it as in depth as perhaps other areas. For instance, he talked about that just being baptized wasn't enough, that you also had to experience the new birth. I didn't feel the need to stress that so greatly. However, that was the point the minister disagreed with me on. I just passed over it a little bit in my summer camp one. But trying to put the emphasis on where a modern audience needs to hear it was another. Contemporary examples which attempt to earn listeners. That was number 5. And so I added in several modern examples and illustrations. Oh, looks like we have unstable internet. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, good.
Yeah, we lost you for a moment, so you might want to go back to the beginning of point 5.
Okay, so point 5 was use modern language and contemporary examples which attempt to make Wesley's teaching clear to modern listeners. Obviously, in order to connect to people today, you can't use examples that Wesley used back then, and sometimes he was fairly sparse on examples regardless, at least in the published works. And so I that I had heard and also made some up from my own life experience and just a thought process. Number 6, I put in there the sermon should not be a history lesson and should not quote Wesley excessively. It is a new sermon on the themes chosen by Wesley. And so even though the sermon is coming from Wesley, it shouldn't be preached as though I'm saying, well, this is the marks of the new birth as presented by Wesley. Here's what he said. No, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to actually produce a sermon that is also my own. And so I think in the sermon I may have said once, as Wesley said, but only once as an example. Number 7, the purpose of this sermon is not a doctrinal lesson, but for transformation. Purpose of the sermon is not a doctrinal lesson, but for transformation. So while doctrine may be a part of it, I am not trying to, in areas where Wesley may, I think, may sound a little bit too doctrinal, I try to make it more of a preaching moment, if that makes sense. Number 8, I will attempt to state the principles of the sermon in a positive manner. If you go through this sermon and others, Wesley likes to tell you often by negative example what things are not. For instance, in this sermon, he says, faith is not. And he'll go on like that sometimes for quite some time. And just personally, I feel today audiences respond better to affirmative language. Faith is. Sometimes I kept to that in my sermons, sometimes I did not. So I tried to change the focus, the emphasis from negative to positive language. So those were the criteria that I used to try to overcome some of those challenges that I faced. As far as outcomes, interestingly enough, we attended a different church on Sunday morning after this preaching seminar, directly after this preaching seminar. We knew the individual preaching, and we had heard this person before, and in our opinion, he gave the best sermon he's ever given. And without prodding, one of the people in his congregation also said that that was also the best sermon they had ever heard from him. So we like to think that the preaching conference had some influence on his preparation and his delivery. Also, there is a follow-up preachers conference in March, which will last 2 days, and several ministers will present their contemporary Wesleyan sermons. We already have people lined up to do that. And at least in theory, that could be as many as 5 different people. They have signed up to do so. And we're grateful that got that sort of response. I think that our goal was that eventually we'll get about 20 of these sermons. We'll see how that transpires over time. Regarding the publishing, we have not yet looked too seriously into that issue. However, it is our desire that after we collect several of these together, that we can put them in some sort of published form for the hopefully the use of the Estonian Methodist Church. And so it's been an interesting project. I have to say, for me, it's stretched me. but it's also enjoyable in its own way to do something that you haven't done before. And it's also enjoyable in its own way to know you're the first person to do something. So now I can sit back and watch those other sermons and just have a good time. But once again, I thank you all for the opportunity to study at Manchester, and it was really helpful in putting together that sermon, and it was also very helpful in putting together the lecture that I also presented with the pastors. And let me just end by saying thank you for your time today. It's been a joy to be able to present and talk to you about what goes on in Estonia. It's my second home now, and I'm glad to serve the church here.
All right. Thank you very much, Doug. It's good to hear in more depth what you knew a little bit about in terms of the outline of the project, and see a great deal of thought and work is gone into it, and it's good to know in a lot of ways that it's still being outworked, and some of the fruits are still in the future from it with the conference in March and beyond. So we have a little bit of time for any questions that any of you would like to ask or comment.
Well, I would like to make a comment. I think this is a really fascinating experiment in teaching theology, preaching, and community formation that goes quite beyond the wonderful virtue of passing on Wesley to another group of people and making his thought accessible to them. This is a terrible question to ask at the moment of, you're celebrating your project, but take a year or two from now. Have you given thought to how you continue this teaching and preaching and community formation?
That's a good question. We really, I think we have not. That's a good thing for us to consider, how we keep that project going. We definitely want, as I said, for a number of these sermons to be done, so we definitely should formulate a little more of a plan for them to be writing these.
I have a question. Thank you very much. A very interesting talk. The question is, I'm intrigued with your criteria for preaching a John Wesley sermon, and wondered if you think this is a good generic template that would be applied to other sermons, such as Augustine, for example.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I'll just pull up my list here and just look just for a second. I think that it would be applicable to any sermon. One person's sermons that I occasionally have read in the past in sermon preparation was Charles Spurgeon. When I was a pastor in the United States and would preach every week, occasionally I would just pull up one of his sermons and read it. And one reason was that the guy seemed to pretty much comment on every angle of a message. So you get a pretty good commentary that way. And also I knew a pastor who had done that when I was in seminary. But yeah, I think it would be helpful to use that for any sermon. I have to refine it more, though, I must say.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear you exploring a question that I've thought myself for lots of years. It's really interesting to hear about it. It's a brilliant project, it sounds like. And I was just wondering, I don't know if you've already covered this in a way when you were talking about the differences and the things that you would emphasize, like when you were bringing Wesley's sermon into the present day style. But what would you say were the biggest or the most notable differences in the things that he would emphasise, the way he would preach, the kind of sermon he would preach or that he published, with a modern, what you would call a modern style of preaching. What are the most notable differences?
It is red.
If I have to say that again, I'll say it
See if it comes back.
Maybe you can hear us. Videos.
Are you there?
It's probably our internet.
the
The one in Estonia is generally much better than the one here.
We got through the whole talk.
Yeah.
Okay. See if we can. Yeah. Okay. John, do you want to make your question again?
The question was, having looked at all this, what are the most notable differences in between Wesley's preaching and what you would call a modern style of preaching? Differences in emphasis. You mentioned using lots of scriptures and negative examples. What are the major differences?
So what are the main differences between what I see as modern preaching and how Wesley preached?
With constructed sermon,
Yeah, I think one major aspect is how many points Wesley will include in each message. I think if anything in modern sermons, they're pushing towards less is better, one idea per sermon. For myself, when I was looking at his message, one stylistic difference we had was when he's preaching this marks of the new birth, I'm automatically seeing in his work 3 sermons because he has 3 marks. So I'm going to be doing one on faith, one on hope, and one on love. But he's putting it all in there. So, and in fairness, we don't, as I understand it, we don't 100% know how exactly he preached these things because these are the printed versions. But that's one difference I see. And also, I see that he puts a lot of scripture in there. As I said, people reacted to that. It's not that these are people who would be averse to scripture. It's just, why are you having 3 scriptures in one segment, in the faith segment? Why not just one? I think that's how their reaction. So things like that I see as stylistically different. And in my opinion, also, when I preach, and the way I was taught to preach, you take a verse and then you exegete that, where he's more topically going down the line of the verses instead. So that's a difference that I see stylistically between the 2 of us, and maybe different today as well.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Have you had a chance to look at any of his other sermons to see if the ones that were standard are in any kind of way distinct from the others?
Yeah, I've never really thought of that way because I have read sermons that are not in the standard 52, but I've never critically thought about the differences. I just presumed the ones in the 52 were, I remember vaguely that he said something about that these were the most important, doctrines or whatever. So there is the thought process he had in presenting them the way that he did. But to my amateurish brain on that question, I think that they seem to be pretty standard in how he preached, the other sermons I've seen.
I would just like to say that your presentation has given me thoughts about how we can do this in our setting in Lebanon and in Arabic. We failed to bring Wesley to our Arabic audience in many ways, and your presentation has given me new ideas on how to do that. We do a good job of presenting his books or his theology, but his sermons and the way he preached, we've never gone into that, which I think would be a good way to Wesley to our audience also.
That's awesome. That's awesome to hear. I have to give credit where credit's due. This comes out of a brain smarter than my own. My wife was the one who originally had the thought. That's the great benefit of being married to her.
Yeah, that will be worth thinking about as the project continues to go. Whether it's there are ways to export it to other contexts. Maybe the natural one there is if it's exportable to other Baltic countries, but maybe through the European Methodist network, the Methodist Theological schools in Europe, there may be ways of trying to think about how it can be used as a model that could be adapted in some ways for other contexts.
Yes, I will pass that on.
So your wife's on the committee with me there, so she may raise that at some point.
Yeah, she's getting around nowadays in her new job.
But I think I'm really glad that you are writing this up as you're going and keeping track of this, because I think that, in another year, you're going to have a really important essay on your experiment. So I would urge you to keep at that.
All right.
Yeah, and I think, what you've outlined today, I think could be useful in itself for putting out there and publishing to give people insight into how you've gone about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks very much, Doug, for this project and for sharing it with us. And we'll hope to stay in contact as it develops further.
All righty. Well, thank you very much for having me. And once again, thanks for letting me do the work there.
Indeed, we'll look forward to more contact with you both as we go on.
Sounds great.